A widow with triplets was being sold to pay her husband's debt until a silent rancher stood up. The market square buzzed with activity. Horses whinnied and snorted, cattle lowed, and men shouted bids over gnarled tables. But in one shadowed corner, the air tasted of desperation rather than profit. A woman and 3 children were herded onto a raised platform of rough-hewn planks. It was supposed to be a sale, one more stage in the commerce of misery that threaded through this dusty frontier town. Hank Berriman stepped forward, hand clenched into a gauntleted fist. He pointed at the pale, trembling woman. 3 small faces peeked from behind her skirts. She looked too young to be a widow, but death had already claimed her husband. He roared across the crowd. Her husband owed me $1,000, lost it all at the card table, and then dropped dead like a sack of grain. Now she and her spawn are my property. I intend to use her for work until the debt is paid. Sarah held her ground. Her fingers clenched the thin fabric around her children. 1 boy, 2 girls, all under 3 and eyes wide with fear. Her voice cracked as she spoke. They are only children. They do not owe you anything. Please, do not take them. Berriman sneered. His brute of a worker grabbed the son's arm, dragging him forward. The twins were wrenched from Sarah's grasp. Their wails cut through the crowd. She sank to her knees, her own voice rising in a raw plea. "Oh, God, no, not them!" She wrapped her arms around the brother as the twins slipped away. She tried to hold on, but 2 strong arms yanked him free too. She fell backwards, still clutching the air where her kids had been. Then she dropped to the ground and crawled, reaching out to Berriman's legs, sobbing until she had nothing left. His boot connected with her side. She gasped and rolled away, blood blooming at the corner of her mouth. Laughter rippled through the milling onlookers, cruel and oblivious. A merchant spat on the ground. Jonas Cade stepped from the circle of cowboys and drunks. A tall man in his early 40s, rugged and silent, wearing a worn leather coat the color of sun-baked earth. He laid down a bottle of whiskey on the wooden plank. He walked toward the platform, the gathering hushing as his shadow passed over them. "I will pay the full debt, for her, and for the children." A ripple of incredulous laughter met him. A cattle drover stepped forward, leering. "Think you got money, old man? That coat says you have none." The cattleman's mockery drew knowing sniggers. Berriman glared, but he wasn't done. He grabbed the salt-stained ledger, thumbed a page, and looked up at Jonas. 500, and not a cent less. And I want them here by sunrise tomorrow. Jonas put his hand into his coat. When he pulled out the object the crowd saw flicker in the sunlight, silence fell. It was a simple silver necklace, the tarnish worn in around a small locket. Jonas laid it gently on the table. "I don't have it all today, but this means something to me. It belonged to my mother. I'll be back with the rest, and you'll let her and the children go." The crowd didn't move. Berriman stared at the necklace, his lip curling. "You want to give your mother's keepsake for this lot? For a woman and her kids? You're more foolish than I thought." Jonas met Berriman's gaze and spoke quietly. "Then I will prove I am not foolish." He turned, didn't glance back at the stunned faces. With deliberate steps, he picked up his bottle and walked toward the edges of the square. On the platform, Sarah had sobbed herself silent. The children huddled around her, reaching for her skirt. She looked up at the necklace on the table, confusion and hope mingling on her face. Through the growing hush and the cruel laughter, one thing stood clear. Someone had stepped forward. Someone had seen their worth. And for one ragged heartbeat, against the roar of the world, hope began to glimmer in her eyes. The wagon wheels rolled slowly over the dusty trail, the sun dipping behind the canyon rim as evening pressed down. Sarah sat hunched in the back, clutching her 3 children close to her chest, her arms forming a desperate wall against the world. Every bump of the road jostled them, but she barely noticed. Her eyes stared at nothing. Her mind repeated one thing. She had been bought again. She did not look at the man driving the wagon. She dared not. Every man who had ever helped her had taken more than they gave. So when she spoke, it was barely a whisper, her head bowed low. "Thank you." "Sir, I'll do as you say. I'll work hard. You don't need to worry." Jonas Cade didn't respond. His eyes stayed on the path ahead. The reins in his hands twitched only slightly as the horses climbed the final ridge above the valley. The house came into view just as dusk fell, a plain log cabin with a sagging porch nestled against the line of pine trees. A thin thread of smoke curled from the chimney. The only sound was the wind brushing through the grass and the soft whimpers of one of the twins. Jonas stepped down first. He didn't say a word. He lifted the children gently, one by one, and carried them inside, carefully laying them on a single mattress beside the stove. Then he turned to Sarah and handed her a tin cup of water. "You and the kids sleep in here tonight. I'll be in the barn." She looked up briefly, startled, but he was already walking away, the wooden door creaking shut behind him. That night, Sarah lay curled around her children like a broken shell. She didn't sleep. Not really. Her ears stayed tuned to every creak and gust. She waited for the knock on the door, the demand to undress, the price of safety she had paid too many times before, but it never came. When dawn broke, she slipped quietly from the blanket, careful not to wake the children. She began to work. She scrubbed the floor with her skirt, fetched water from the pump out back, and tried to make porridge with the cornmeal she found in a sack. Her hands bled from the cold water. She wrapped them in rags and kept going. If she worked hard, maybe he would let them stay longer. Maybe he wouldn't send the children away. She was stirring the pot with trembling fingers when the door creaked open again. Jonas stood there, backlit by morning light. He looked at her, really looked. Her hands were red and swollen, her dress soaked from the waist down. The scent of smoke clung to her, mixed with desperation. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't move. "You don't need to act like a servant," he said calmly, eyes unreadable. "And you don't need to bleed to prove your worth, Shelter." She froze, wooden spoon hovering over the pot. "Just take care of the children. That's all I ask." She turned to face him, slow, uncertain, her mouth parted as if to speak, but the words stuck. Instead, she stared. At the man with dust on his boots and silence in his bones. At the one man who had not asked anything from her in return. She didn't know whether to trust him. She didn't know if kindness like that could be real. But for the first time since her husband's death, she looked someone in the eye. And in the way Jonas watched her, not as a burden, not as a prize, but as a person, she saw something flicker inside herself, a sliver of something almost forgotten. Hope. Every morning, Sarah rose before the sun. The sky still wore its indigo veil when she crept quietly from the mattress, careful not to disturb the sleeping bodies of her children. She stoked the stove, fetched water from the pump, scrubbed dishes, and swept the cabin's worn floorboards until her hands were raw. She mucked out the horse stalls, even though her shoulders ached. The memory of being owned lingered like a bruise, so she worked hard, harder than necessary, as if sheer effort could earn permanence. Jonas never told her to stop. He also never asked for more. Outside, the children adapted quickly. They played tag around the front porch, invented games with rocks and sticks, and took turns petting the old hound that lounged in the sun like he too had known too many storms. The boys started calling Jonas Silent Uncle, and the name stuck. Jonas would nod, barely reacting, but a faint smile sometimes pulled at the edge of his weather-worn lips. He did not speak much, but his hands were never idle. He fixed the warped step on the porch, patched holes in the roof, and sanded down splinters on the railing so the twins could lean over without cutting their arms. One afternoon he built 3 stools, each just the right height for the children to sit at the kitchen table. He carved their initials into the legs. Then came the little things. A new hook for Sarah's shawl by the door. A line strung outside so she could dry clothes. And then, quietly, without fanfare, he placed a small wooden box on the table, one evening, and walked away. Inside was a worn ivory comb, a neatly folded cotton handkerchief, and 3 pairs of wool socks, child-sized, hand-stitched, soft as clouds. Sarah stared at it for a long time. She did not ask if he made them. She knew he did. That night, the sky broke open. The rain came down hard, wind howling through the trees like wolves mourning the moon. Thunder shook the ground, and lightning cracked the darkness. The children huddled together in fear, but it was not the storm that broke Sarah's calm. Her son, Jonah, burned with fever. His skin was hot to the touch, his breathing ragged. His small body shivered and sweated all at once. Sarah tried cold compresses, cradled him against her chest, but panic crept into her veins with every minute. "I need help," she whispered, almost to herself. Jonas, who had just returned from checking the barn, caught the words. He looked at the boy, touched his forehead, then turned and disappeared into the night without a word. Sarah stood frozen at the door, rain stinging her face, watching the dark swallow him whole. Time dragged, an hour, maybe more. Then, footsteps, a shadow at the edge of the porch. Jonas returned soaked to the bone, his shirt clinging to him like a second skin. In his hands was a bundle of damp herbs tied with twine. He thrust them toward Sarah, water dripping from his hair and fingertips. "Boil these," he said hoarsely. "Wrap the steam in a cloth, press it to his chest, then the forehead. It'll bring him down." She moved without thinking, heart pounding. The cabin filled with the scent of pine and sharp roots. They sat on either side of the child, trading cloths and water, whispering comfort neither one fully believed. The fire crackled low. Morning tiptoed over the mountains. When the sun rose, Jonah's fever had broken. Sarah sat with her back against the wall, arms curled around the now sleeping boy. Jonas leaned in the doorway, steam still lifting from his soaked clothes, eyes half closed from exhaustion. She looked at him, really looked, and for the first time she did not see a man who had bought her freedom like livestock. She saw a man who had run through a storm with nothing but silence and stubbornness to save her son. She saw a father, and for the first time, she believed this roof might one day feel like home. Spring crept in quietly, like a guest too shy to knock. Patches of ice still clung to the shadows beneath the pines, but the earth had begun to soften. The breeze carried the scent of thaw and possibility. Sarah knelt near the porch, her fingers stained with soil, carefully pressing seeds into the ground. Forget-me-nuts, lavender, wild daisies, flowers her mother had once taught her to tend back when her world had still been warm. The children ran barefoot through the tall grass, laughing as they chased the old hound. The boy tugged playfully at Jonas's beard one afternoon, and the twins giggled so hard they fell over in the dirt. Jonas grunted, pretending annoyance, but the corner of his mouth twitched. From the window, Sarah watched them, dish towel in hand, chest rising with something she could not name. Gratitude, yes, but threaded through with a quiet ache. Guilt. Because every moment of peace felt borrowed. Every act of kindness from Jonas reminded her that he had traded something sacred, his mother's necklace, to buy her and the children a second chance. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge and Jonas hammered a new window frame into place, Sarah stepped onto the porch. She carried a worn cloth bundle in her hands. Her fingers trembled as she held it out. "This," she said, eyes fixed on the ground, "was my mother's. A silver hairpin. I have carried it since I was a girl, even when I had no home left to carry it in." She opened the cloth, revealing the delicate pin, shaped like a plum blossom, its edges smoothed by years of holding and heartbreak. "You gave away your mother's necklace for us," she continued, voice low. "I cannot let you bear that alone. Please, use this. Get it back." Jonas looked at the pin, then at her. "No," he said softly, voice rough from years of disuse. "I have my way, and you should keep it. Memories like that should not be spent paying someone else's debts." She did not argue, just nodded and walked back inside, the cloth still clutched in her hands. That night, after the children had fallen asleep, Sarah knelt beside their small mattress and cried, not from sorrow, but from something more overwhelming, to be protected and not expected to repay, to be seen and not owned. The next morning she joined Jonas on the porch, 2 tin cups of coffee steaming between them. The flowers she had planted were already beginning to peek through the earth like timid secrets. My husband, she began, was not always like he became. When the mine closed and he lost his job, he lost himself too, drank too much, gambled worse. He told me everything would be fine, until the day the men came knocking. Jonas said nothing, he just listened. Sarah took a breath. He left me a letter, she whispered. Said he had failed us, that there was no way out. I found it the next morning. He'd thrown himself into the river. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was shared, weighted, real. I thought for a long time that it was my fault, Sarah said. That I wasn't strong enough to stop him, that I wasn't worth staying for. But since I've been here, I'm learning something new. Jonas looked out across the green, his fingers tracing the grain of the porch rail. We do not always choose how our story ends, she said, but maybe we can choose what happens next. He nodded once, then turned to her and said quietly, You are the only one here who knows how to grow flowers. Take care of them. She smiled. The tears didn't fall this time, but the warmth that bloomed in her chest felt strong enough to outlast another winter. The necklace had not been reclaimed. Jonas had not gone back to San Rio since the auction. Not to the tavern. Not to Hank Berriman's ranch. And in a town where silence only fed speculation, rumors began to grow like weeds in spring. Stories passed from lips to ears in the saloons and feed stores, that the woman with triplets had been bought but not paid for fully, that Jonas Cade had taken something he had no right to, that Berriman was being made a fool of. Hank did not like being made a fool. He sent Travis. Travis was not a big man, but he had the kind of grin that twisted easy and eyes like broken glass. He had worked for Berriman for years, kept his books, chased his runaways, did things Hank did not like to be associated with in public. When he rode out toward Jonas's land, he carried no badge, no papers, just a cover story and a flask of rye in his saddlebag. Just a trader, he said when Sarah answered the door. Heard you got a fine garden out here. Thought I might trade for herbs, or maybe eggs. Sarah stood in the doorway, her body half blocking the inside of the cabin. She held her youngest child on her hip. We don't trade much, she said cautiously. Travis chuckled, not deterred. That's so. Shame. Real nice place you've got here. Looks like someone's taken good care of it. And of you. Something in his tone made her skin crawl, but she forced a smile, shallow and polite. Jonas was out at the far pasture, mending a fence. Sarah offered Travis a few dried lavender bundles and sent him on his way, with nothing more than a nod. But long after he disappeared over the ridge, her hands would not stop shaking. That night, she did not tell Jonas. She told herself she was being paranoid, that maybe he really had come for herbs. But 2 nights later, when she stepped outside to shake crumbs from a cloth, she caught the glint of something near the barn. A figure, a shadow slipping around the side of the feed shed. She clutched the cloth tighter, heart hammering. The children were inside. Jonas was asleep in the barn loft. She crept toward the shed, but before she could call out, the figure vanished into the trees. In the morning, Jonas found the knife. It was wedged into one of the porch posts, deep and deliberate. Not rusted, not forgotten. The blade was thin, cruel-looking, with a carved bone handle, the kind used by men who meant business. Jonas pulled it free, turning it slowly in his calloused hands. His jaw set. His face gave nothing away. Sarah stood behind him, holding the screen door half open. I saw someone, she confessed softly. 2 nights ago, near the shed, I thought. I didn't want to worry you. Jonas nodded once, then turned and walked into the barn. She followed. Inside, she found him kneeling beside an old cedar trunk. He opened it, brushed aside a folded Union jacket and a pair of worn boots. Beneath them lay a long case, wrapped in oilskin. A rifle. He pulled it free, sat down on the bench, and began to clean it with slow, precise movements, oiling the chamber, inspecting the sight, running cloth through the barrel. Sarah watched in silence, hands folded tightly. I thought you didn't keep guns, she said quietly. Jonas did not look up. I do not use them unless I have to. She stepped closer, her voice softer. You were a soldier? He nodded. A long time ago. I used this to do things I wish I could forget. He paused, then added almost to himself, but I kept it, in case I ever needed to protect something worth keeping. He placed the rifle gently on the table, staring at it for a long moment. Then, with hands that shook just slightly, he set it down again. I used to carry it to kill, he said. Now I carry it to protect. Outside, a crow called from the edge of the woods. Inside, Sarah reached for his hand and did not let go. The wind came first, long, low gusts that bent the trees and rattled the porch boards. The night sky had turned the color of slate, thick with clouds that swallowed the stars. Jonas had been stacking the last of the firewood when the first crack of thunder rolled across the valley. Inside, the children were already asleep, bundled together like puppies in the warmth of quilts Sarah had stitched from scraps. But she herself could not rest. She stood barefoot on the porch, arms wrapped around her chest, watching the wind toss the treetops like angry waves. Her nightgown clung to her legs, and her hair danced in wild tendrils around her face. She should have gone back inside, but something in her refused to turn away from the storm. Behind her, the door creaked open. Jonas stepped out, a heavy coat in one hand. He said nothing, just draped it around her shoulders. The gesture was simple, familiar, like the wind. It asked for nothing, but lingered beside her. For a long time they stood in silence. Then, quietly, she asked, "You're leaving tomorrow, aren't you? To get the necklace back?" He nodded. Sarah looked down at the coat's fraying cuffs. "You've done so much already." "I made a promise," he said. She turned toward him, eyes shining from the dim light inside. Her voice shook, but not from the cold. "Why?" she asked. "Why do all this? You do not owe me anything, not a single thing." Jonas looked past her, out into the woods that stretched far beyond the cabin, his expression shadowed by something older than the wind. "When I was about 10, he said, voice low and steady, "my mother got sick. We had nothing, no doctor, no money, no help. The man who owned the land we worked, he told us to leave, said he would not waste medicine on someone who could not earn their keep." Sarah's breath caught. Jonas continued, "I carried her out of the house myself. She died the next morning, in the dirt, alone. I buried her with my bare hands beneath a willow tree, and I knelt there in the mud, crying like a child, because I was one." He finally looked at Sarah. "I told myself that day, if I ever saw someone like her again, someone left to die because the world did not care, I would not walk away." The wind howled between them, but it felt quiet. "I could not save her," he said, "but this time I was not going to stand still." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She stepped closer, not with urgency, but with certainty. She reached out, her hand finding his, small and trembling. She did not speak right away. Then softly, "You saved me." Jonas looked down at her hand wrapped around his. He gave the slightest nod. "I tried," he whispered. And in that moment, beneath the storm-heavy sky, the scent of wet earth thick in the air, the silence between them no longer felt like distance. It felt like trust, like a vow that did not need to be spoken. The morning Jonas left, the sky was bruised with gray. He saddled his horse before the children woke and packed only what he needed, water, dried meat, and a map, folded tight in his coat pocket. Sarah stood on the porch, the triplets huddled around her skirts, watching in silence. He did not say much, just a small nod and 2 days, maybe 3. And then he was gone. The trail stretched long and hard, winding through the ghost lands of the old mining country. He passed ravines he once crawled through in his youth, battlefields turned silent, and cabins rotting into the hillsides. At dusk on the second day, he reached a rocky slope nestled behind a thicket of cottonwoods. There he dismounted, tied the horse, and climbed with steady breath to the shallow cave above. The rock still bore the marks of the war, scorch, soot, blood, long since dried into legend. Jonas knelt beside the stone slab near the back of the cave and began to dig. By nightfall, his hands were raw, but the box was free. It was cedar, bound with iron nails. Inside were 4 rough silver bars, dull but heavy, the last of his war pay, hidden away when he could not spend it and could not bear to lose it. He had always thought he would die before using it, but now he would spend it all. When he rode into San Rios that afternoon, dust trailed behind him like smoke. The saloon was busy. Laughter and boots scraped against floorboards worn thin. Hank Berriman sat in his usual corner, whiskey in hand, eyes narrowing the second Jonas entered. Jonas walked straight to his table, unwrapped the cloth bundle from his saddlebag, and laid the silver down on the wooden table. The room quieted. "For the necklace," Jonas said, "and for the freedom you think you bought." Hank stared at the bars, then at Jonas. "Silver's silver, but it ain't enough. I set a price, you remember it." Jonas did not blink. "You set a trap, but I do not bargain with men who take children to prove a point." Hank leaned forward, sneering. "She was mine to claim." "No," Jonas said. His voice was calm, but it held steel. "She was a mother trying to survive, and now she is free. I came to make sure there is no question about that." Hank laughed, a dry, ugly sound. "You think honor buys you the right to speak like that?" "No," Jonas said again. "But this does." He tapped the silver. Then he stood taller. "You cannot buy honor, Hank, but I just paid for my soul." The saloon was silent. No one laughed now. Hank looked at the silver again. Greed flickered behind his eyes. He could press the issue. He could make a scene. But something in Jonas's face, still, weathered, unshaken, gave him pause. "Take your necklace," Hank said finally, tossing the small bundle across the table, "and get out of my town." Jonas caught it in one hand. He did not smile. He simply turned and walked out, the door swinging closed behind him. The ride back felt lighter. The silver was gone. But what he carried now, wrapped tight in cloth, pressed against his chest, was far more valuable. He rode hard, eager to get home before the next storm. And when the cabin came into view, lit by a small fire in the window, Jonas's hands trembled slightly. But his eyes were bright. Spring came quietly that year, not with sudden green, but with gentle hints, patches of wild flowers pushing through the thawing soil, birds returning to the trees, and the slow, steady laughter of children echoing across the valley. The cabin, once a place of shadows and silence, had become something more, a home. Sarah had planted flowers along the porch rail, lavender, forget-me-nots, and yellow daisies that caught the sun like coins. She often sat there, watching her children chase the old dog through the grass, their laughter wild and free. Inside, the house smelled of bread and soap, of mornings begun with purpose and evenings spent in peace. One morning, Sarah sat by the window with her journal, the triplets still asleep in their corner room. She held the necklace Jonas had returned from San Rios, the one he had given up for her freedom, now resting in her palm like a piece of the past made whole. She wrote slowly, carefully. "He once let go of his mother's necklace to save me and my children. If, one day, he chooses to place it on my wrist, I will wear it until the day I die, not as a debt, but as a vow." That afternoon, Jonas walked with her into the fields behind the cabin. The earth was soft beneath their boots, and yellow mustard flowers blanketed the hill like sunlight woven into silk. He had brought no suit, no script, no preacher, just himself, the quiet man she had come to love, steady, scarred, and deeply kind. They stood together beneath the open sky, the triplets fidgeting with wildflower crowns, giggling as they picked petals from their bouquets. Sarah wore a pale blue dress she had sewn herself, the same one she had worn on her first day of freedom. Jonas wore the old coat patched at the elbow, but with a new clasp she had stitched for him from leather scraps. He took her hands. For a moment he said nothing. Then, slowly, he reached into his pocket. Out came the necklace, the silver one, old and worn, but now polished and glinting in the afternoon light. But something was different. On the back of the pendant, where once was only tarnish, new letters had been engraved. Sarah, chosen by the heart. Her eyes filled instantly. Jonas cleared his throat, but his voice stayed firm. This was my mother's. I gave it up once to save you. Now, I want it to be yours, not because I owe you anything, but because I choose you. I choose you every day." She held out her hand, and he fastened the chain around her wrist. It fit perfectly. There was no priest, only the blue sky and the rustle of wind through the flowers. But that day, with 3 children dancing around them and a dog chasing butterflies, Sarah became his wife, not through law, but through love. They shared bread and dried peaches, laughed with neighbors who had wandered up the hill after hearing the news, and watched the sun begin to dip low behind the distant ridge. That night, in the quiet after the children had fallen asleep, Sarah lay with her head against Jonas's chest, her fingers tracing circles over the buttons of his shirt. "Do you remember the first thing I called you?" she whispered. He nodded, smiling faintly. "Master." She smiled back, her voice soft but strong. "I'm not anyone's property anymore. Not a man's, not a debt's. I'm a woman you chose, and I choose you." Jonas closed his eyes, arms pulling her closer. The fire crackled nearby. The world was quiet outside their walls. And as spring crept over the land, turning old wounds into wildflowers, 2 people who had been lost in grief found that they were no longer just survivors. They were home. In a world where a woman could be sold like cattle and a child's cry was silenced by debt, one man stood up, not to own, but to honor. And one woman, broken by betrayal and loss, found that love was not owed, it was chosen. This was not a tale of rescue. It was the story of redemption earned, of dignity restored, and of a family born not from blood, but from courage. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that the heart still knows how to choose, even after it's been bruised, then please like, share, and subscribe to Wild West Love Stories, where every story reminds us that, even in the dust and danger of the old frontier, love still had the final word. Subscribe now and ride with us into the next story that was never meant to be forgotten.